Welcome back to Marcus's Galactic Tales. I am your narrator, and tonight we bring you a story about the most dangerous thing a cynical man can do: open a door he was paid to keep shut. This is the story of Rael Voss, a human smuggler running cargo in the dead spaces between stars, and of Seris Vethara, a royal prisoner who had never once in her life made a choice that was entirely her own. This is She Was Never Free. Part 1, Port Vareth. The smell of Port Vareth hit you before the docking clamps did. It was a smell that no amount of atmospheric scrubbing could fully eliminate, because it was not merely chemical, it was existential. It was the concentrated exhale of 10,000 beings who had all arrived here with somewhere better to be, and had all, for various reasons, stayed too long: machine lubricant and recycled oxygen. The sulphurous undertone of Grell cooking vats on the lower promenade. The metallic sweetness of fuel additives bleeding through a ventilation system that had not been properly maintained since the third administration. And underneath all of it, barely perceptible but always there, the specific cold that came from being 17 light minutes from the nearest star with a hull that was doing its best. Rael Voss had docked here enough times to stop noticing the smell. That, he had learned, was either a sign of adaptation or a sign of moral erosion. He was no longer sure which. He was 34 years old, which by the reckoning of most species that bothered to track such things meant he was somewhere in the broad middle territory of his life, still young enough to have plans and old enough to know. Plans were mostly fiction. He had 912 cred marks to his name, a cargo hauler that owed him nothing and cost him everything, and a contract offer sitting in his message queue that he had been pretending he hadn't read for the last 3 hours. He read it again now, sitting in the cockpit of the tethered mule, with a bulb of synthetic coffee going cold in his left hand and the familiar low thrum of the station's docking resonance working its way up through the landing struts and into his spine. The message was from Mira Calloway. Mira Calloway was, depending on who you asked, either a freight logistics coordinator with an admirably creative approach to manifest documentation, or the most reliably dangerous fixer operating in the outer drift. She had found Rael useful twice before. Both times had been profitable. Both times had also been the kind of profitable that required him to spend 3 weeks afterward jumping between minor ports in unpredictable patterns, developing a keen interest in whether anyone was following him. He had both times eventually concluded that no one was. He was, both times, incorrect, but incorrectly in ways that had never fully materialized into consequences. A distinction that felt increasingly thin the longer he thought about it. The message was short. Mira's messages were always short. Rael, I have a cargo run. Single item, Corova class compatible. No questions on pickup, no questions on delivery. Triple rate. Triple rate. Triple rate was 900 cred marks for a standard short haul, and significantly more for anything that required drift travel. Triple rate was the kind of number that did not appear in ordinary commerce. Triple rate was either an enormous opportunity or an enormous warning, and in Rael's experience those two things were so frequently the same thing that he had stopped trying to distinguish between them on first contact. He turned the message over in his head the way he turned everything over. Methodically, without sentiment. He needed the money. The mule needed a thermal coupling replacement on the port engine housing, and if he skipped that replacement for another 2 or 3 runs, he was going to lose the engine entirely in mid-drift, which was technically survivable, but unpleasantly so. He had a parts debt at Vareth Station that the maintenance operator, a squat and perpetually disappointed Grell named Vethara, was beginning to express through increasingly pointed silences. He thumbed a reply. Available. Where and when? The response came back in under 4 minutes, which meant Mira had been waiting. That should have told him something. Bay 47. 2 hours.
Come alone, obviously.
He finished the cold coffee because he was the kind of person who finished things, set the bulb in the recycler and stood up. Deeks, he said. Already awake, said the ship's AI, its voice coming from a speaker cluster above the pilot's seat, with the particular tone of something that had been awake for quite some time, and was mildly offended at the implication that it needed prompting. Dex. short for the considerably longer designation Data Exchange System Mark 11, which Rael had never once used, had been installed in the mule by her previous owner, and had, over 3 years, developed what Rael chose to think of as a personality, and what Dex chose to think of as an entirely reasonable calibration of priorities. "We have a meeting at Bay 47 in 2 hours, Rael said. "I know. I read the message when it came in. You read my messages. I monitor all communications traffic interfacing with the ship's systems. You set those parameters yourself. I set them so you'd know if hegemony enforcement was querying us. I don't distinguish. Information is information. Your message from Mira Calloway arrived at 14:07 station time, and I have already cross-referenced her last 3 known aliases against drift freight manifests for the past 90 days. Would you like the summary?" Rael paused at the hatch leading down to the cargo hold. "How much trouble?" "That depends on your definition of trouble, which historically has been flexible in ways I find professionally challenging." She moved 2 sealed containers through the Vethara relay point 6 weeks ago. The manifest listed them as cultural artifacts. The declared weight on both was significantly lower than their actual transit signature. Cultural artifacts is a common cover for smuggled goods. Yes, but cultural artifacts don't usually generate the kind of hegemony compliance query that got quietly suppressed by someone with level 6 clearance before it could be actioned. Someone paid to make that query disappear. Expensively. Rael was quiet for a moment. He pressed the heel of his hand against the cold metal of the hatch frame. The station's thrumming was steady and indifferent beneath his feet. "Triple rate," he said, more to himself than to Dex. "Triple rate," Dex confirmed. "I am not going to tell you not to go to the meeting. I know better. But I want it noted for the record that I noticed these things and told you about them." "Noted. Good. I find that comforting. Go have your meeting." Bay 47 was at the end of a service corridor on Vareth's mid-level, far enough from the main promenade that the ambient noise dropped to a low mechanical susurrus, the breathing of the station's innards. The overhead lighting was the color of old bone. The floor was grated metal that rang faintly underfoot. Mira Calloway was already there, leaning against a cargo lifter with the particular ease of someone who had spent enough time in uncomfortable places to stop caring about posture. She was a compact woman in her late 40s with close-cropped silver hair and a face that had been weathered by somewhere in the outer reaches before Rael had ever known her. She had the careful stillness of someone who was always watching the exit. She handed him a data chip before he'd finished stopping. "What's on it?" Rael asked. "Pickup coordinates, delivery point, rate structure." She paused. "And a manifest. What does the manifest say?" "Cultural artifacts." Rael looked at her. She looked back. Neither of them looked away for long enough to constitute a contest. "Mira, the less you know, the cleaner your run. That's what someone says when what I know is going to bother me." The corner of her mouth moved. It was not quite a smile. "The pickup is a sealed hegemony-grade transport container. It's already been cleared through the outer checkpoint. It will be waiting in Bay 7. You load it, you fly it to the delivery coordinates in the chip, you collect your payment from the automated relay and fly away. Clean, simple, fast. Hegemony-grade transport container," Rael repeated. "Yes, those are rated for pressurized, temperature-controlled, and biologically active cargo. Among other things, most cultural artifacts don't require biological support systems." Mira's expression didn't change. "Rael, triple rate." He looked at the chip in his hand. He thought about the thermal coupling. He thought about Votha's disappointed silences. He thought about his account balance, which was not quite enough to cover the next 3 months' support fees and fuel, and eating something that was not synthesized protein blocks. He thought about his brother Cale, who had died believing that some things were worth more than money, and about how Rael had spent the 6 years since his death trying to determine whether Cale had been right or simply young. He put the chip in his pocket. "If this burns me," he said, "I'm going to find you." "If this burns you," Mira said, "finding me will be the least of your problems. Bay 7. Containers already loaded. You're clear for departure in 4 hours." She walked away. He listened to her footsteps ring off the grating until they disappeared around a corner. And then there was just the breathing of the station and the weight of the chip in his pocket. He went back to the mule. He didn't go to Bay 7 immediately. He spent 2 of the 4 hours doing what he always did before a run that felt wrong. He checked every system on the tethered mule with the thoroughness of a man who believed that preparation was the closest thing to prayer that worked in the observable universe. He ran diagnostics on the drive array. He recalibrated the fold-nav system manually, ignoring Dex's offer to do it automatically, because the physical act of recalibration steadied him in ways he could not entirely explain. He checked the emergency beacon, the emergency rations, the emergency atmospheric reserve. He checked the secondary hull seal on the cargo hold because it had been slightly off last run and had since been adjusted, but he liked to verify. "You're nervous," Dex said. "I'm thorough. You're both, and you're using one as a cover for the other." "Dex, run me a legal definition search, hegemony code. What categories of cargo require a biologically supported transport container?" A pause. "You want me to search for this now?" "Yes. Rather than looking at what's in the container in Bay 7, I'd rather know what I'm theoretically carrying before I see what I'm actually carrying." Another pause. "Hegemony Cargo Classification Code, Appendix D, Subcategory 11. Biologically active cargo requiring sealed, atmospherically supported transport includes live specimens for research or exhibition under Convention 7A, preserved biological material for scientific study, organic cultural objects requiring controlled environments, medical shipments classified under the Humanitarian Transit Accord." And Dex stopped. "And," Rael said, "and persons transported under Hegemony Compliance Directive 88. The cockpit was very quiet. "What," Rael said carefully, "is Hegemony Compliance Directive 88? "It's the regulatory framework governing the transit of individuals held under the Glass Accord, political wards, diplomatic assets." A pause that was slightly longer than Dex's pauses usually ran. "Prisoners in any language that doesn't have a legal department." Rael sat down in the pilot seat. He sat there for 47 seconds, which he knew because he was counting them. "How many cred marks in my account?" he said finally. 912. "And triple rate on a drift distance haul, minimum 4,500, depending on the delivery distance." He sat with that for a moment longer. Then he said, "Go ahead and run the departure check. I'm going to Bay 7. "Rael, I know, do you?" "I know what it could be, Dex. I also know what 912 cred marks is. I know what the thermal coupling costs. I know what 3 months of port fees costs. And I know that I don't actually know anything yet. All I have is a legal definition and a suspicious manifest. Get to Bay 7 and find a container full of rare ethery cultural ceramics. Do you believe that?" He didn't answer. He left the cockpit and went down the interior ladder to the cargo hold, and from there through the main airlock and across the docking tube to Bay 7. The container was waiting. It was a standard Hegemony-grade sealed unit, 1.5 meters wide, 2.5 meters long, 0.5 meter deep. The alloy was the particular shade of grey that the Hegemony used for official equipment, a grey so deliberate and total that it almost seemed like a philosophical statement. There were no identifying marks except a serial number in Hegemony standard script and a small environmental status panel on the end face. The panel showed a green light, interior atmosphere nominal, temperature stable, pressure sealed. There was also a weight indicator embedded in the loading frame below it. Rael looked at the weight indicator. He pulled up the manifest on his personal comm. According to the manifest, the container held cultural artifacts with a total declared weight of 40 kilograms. The weight indicator on the loading frame read 87 kilograms. He stood there in Bay 7 with the station humming around him and the cold of the docking level working through the soles of his boots, and he looked at the number 47 kilogram discrepancy between what Mira had told him he was carrying and what physics said he was carrying, and he made a decision. Not the decision to take the cargo. He had already made that one, the decision about what kind of person he was going to be for the rest of this run. He keyed his comm, DX. "I'm loading the container. Prep for departure, and run me a continuous environmental scan on the cargo hold from the moment it's aboard." "What am I scanning for?" "Life signs," Rael said. Continuous, real-time, a pause. Understood, Dex said. Part 2. The drift they cleared Port Vareth's outer marker at 16:20 station time, which meant they had 6 hours before the departure would be logged in the hegemony traffic system, and another 2 hours after that before anyone would notice or care that a Korova-class cargo hauler had departed on an unspecified drift heading. 8 hours. Rael pushed the mule to her comfortable cruising speed, which was the nautical equivalent of a respectably brisk walk, and let the drift swallow them. The drift was the space between hegemony traffic lanes, not uncharted exactly, because everything this close to the core sectors had been mapped, but unmonitored in the way that matters. No relay beacons, no enforcement patrols. The signal lag to the nearest hegemony station was severe enough that anything you did out here was, for practical purposes, only visible to you and whatever was in the hold. Dex's voice came without preamble. "The container has an occupant." Rael had known it would. He had been sitting in the pilot's seat with his hands on the control surfaces, not because he needed to steer. The mule could navigate drift for hours without his hands on anything, but because having them there gave him something to do with his body while his mind went through what came next. "Alive?" he said. "Yes, one life sign, consistent vital readings. The biological signature is..." Dex paused. "Ethery." Rael closed his eyes. He kept them closed for 3 seconds. Then he opened them and looked at the navigation readout, which showed him a featureless expanse of drift, with nothing interesting in any direction, for approximately 4 hours. "How would you characterize the condition of the life sign?" he said. "Stable. Resting pulse within species normal parameters. Respiration normal. There's a residual chemical signature in the container atmosphere consistent with sedation compound hegemony grade compliance 7, which is used primarily for prisoner transport," Rael said. "Yes. How long until the sedative wears off?" "Based on the residual concentration and standard Aethori metabolic processing, approximately 90 minutes to first consciousness, another 40 minutes to full cognitive function. So he had roughly 2 hours before whoever was in that container woke up." He sat with that for a while. The drift moved past the viewports in the specific way that the drift always moved, which was to say it did not move at all. Stars at this distance were decorative. Space was simply dark and vast and indifferent, and the tethered mule was a small, warm machine moving through it with the conviction of a thing that had somewhere to be, even if the thing inside it was not yet sure what that somewhere was going to mean. Rael unstrapped from the pilot's seat and went down to the cargo hold. He stood in front of the container for a long time. The hold smelled of machine oil and carbon scoring, and the particular old ship smell that accumulated in every vessel that had been running long enough to have its own history. The overhead lights were work-grade, utilitarian, and they lit the container's grey surface with complete and merciless clarity. He studied the locking mechanism. It was a hegemony, compliance-grade magnetic seal, keyed to an authorization code he did not have. The environmental panel was green. The atmosphere inside was breathable. The temperature was comfortable. He did something that he told himself was purely practical, which was that he found a cargo crate, dragged it over, and sat down in front of the container to wait. He told himself it was purely practical because he needed to be here when the occupant regained consciousness, to assess the situation, to determine what exactly he was dealing with. He did not examine too closely the part of the reason. That was simply that no one should wake up in a locked box alone. He waited. He heard it before the environmental panel changed. A sound so low it was below hearing, almost, more of a pressure than a note. A resonance. He felt it in the bones of his sternum before he consciously registered it as sound. The Ethery were a species whose nervous system had evolved over millions of years to communicate through layered harmonic resonance, a biological sound production capability that operated across a wider frequency range than most species' hearing, and which created, in the air around them, something that human ears processed less as sound and more as feeling. What Rael felt, sitting on a cargo crate in the hold of the tethered mule in the middle of the drift, was this: fear. Old fear, the kind that had been present long enough to become almost indistinguishable from the baseline. And beneath it, buried deep, The first tentative probe of a consciousness surfacing from sedation, reaching out and finding walls. The environmental panel flickered. A shift in the air pressure inside as the occupant moved. Then a voice. It was low and precise, and it spoke Galactic Standard with an accent that shaped the vowels differently from human speech. Longer, rounder, carrying undertones, the way a plucked string carries harmonics even after the fundamental note has faded. "Who is there?" the voice said. Rael had rehearsed this. He had a version of this conversation planned. It was practical and efficient, and established the facts clearly and without unnecessary sentiment. He said, "My name is Rael Voss. I'm the pilot of this ship. You're safe." A long pause. Safe. The word came back to him with a quality he could not quite name. Not disbelief exactly. Something older than disbelief. Something that had heard the word safe attached to things that were not safe often enough to have developed a careful relationship with the word. Define your meaning. You're not in danger from me. I'm not going to hurt you. I have water and rations outside this container when you're ready for them. You do not know who I am." "I don't," Rael said. "The manifest I was given said cultural artifacts. I'd like to correct that error if you're willing to help me." Silence. Then the resonance shifted. Still that sub-audible hum, but changed, turned inward, the frequency of something calculating. "If you know I am not cultural artifacts," the voice said slowly, "then you know I am a person. And if you know I am a person and you have chosen to speak to me, rather than to proceed to your delivery point, then you are either reconsidering your commission, or you are attempting to gather information about the cargo before delivery to ensure a better negotiating position." "Which is it?" Rael was quiet for a moment. "Honestly, I haven't decided yet." Another pause. The resonance shifted again. He felt something move in his sternum. Something that might, if he were a less practical person, have been labeled as surprise. "That," said the voice, "is the first honest thing anyone has said to me in 11 months. The lock on the container was a hegemony compliance seal. He could not open it from the outside without the authorization code. He told her this directly and without hedging. "I know," she said. "It can only be opened from the authorization console or from the inside." "From the inside," Rael repeated. "The glass accord compliance locks have an emergency release that can be triggered from within. It requires a harmonic resonance key. The key is biological. It is generated by the prisoner." "Then you can pause." "Not yet." He waited for her to explain. She didn't, and he didn't push. He sat on his cargo crate, and she sat somewhere in the sealed container. He could hear faint movements now, the small sounds of a person shifting, carefully, in a confined space, and they were quiet together in the hold of the tethered mule, while the drift moved past outside. "Tell me your name," Rael said eventually. "Names are political in my culture. A name carries lineage and obligation. To give you my name is to give you a claim. I don't want a claim. I want something to call you." The silence ran longer this time. The sub-audible resonance shifted through something he couldn't name. "Seris," she said finally. "You may call me Seris." "Seris." He tried the weight of it. "I'm Rael. The ship is the tethered mule. The AI is Dex." "Hello," said Dex through the cargo hold speaker, and Rael was fairly certain he had not asked for that contribution. "Hello," Seris said with what sounded like genuine but cautious courtesy. "I've been monitoring your vitals," Dex said. "You're dehydrated." "Rael, she should have water." "The container is sealed, Dex. There's an environmental exchange port on the left side of the unit. It's how the internal atmosphere system works." "It's large enough for a hydration bulb." Rael stood, found a hydration bulb from the hold's emergency supplies, and located the exchange port on the container's left side. It was small, barely 3 centimeters across, but the bulb's flexible tip fit through with minimal pressure. He heard the small sounds of someone taking it from the other side. The quiet that followed had a quality of need being met briefly, and it made something shift in him that he would have preferred not to shift. "Thank you," Seris said. "Don't thank me yet," Rael said. He sat back down. "Tell me why you're in a hegemony compliance container. Who are you to them?" A very long pause. "I am the third daughter of the Vethara Ascendancy," she said. "My full designation, in the register that matters to the people who put me in this container, is Seris Vale Tharin, Ward of the Hegemony Council under the Glass Accord. Category 3 political asset. Rael absorbed this. And before you were a Category 3 political asset, a princess who said publicly that the Glass Accord should not have been signed. The resonance in her voice carried something that was not quite bitterness. It was drier and cooler than bitterness, which was an emotion for people who still expected better. That is all it took. 11 months. Your own government signed the Glass Accord. My mother signed the Glass Accord. My mother is the ascendant of Tharis Prime. She was promised continued independence of governance in exchange for 10 years of preferential resource access and the delivery of 3 senior members of the royal house as political wards to serve as guarantee of compliance. A pause. My 2 sisters are already in the hegemony capital. They arrived willingly. They believe it is an honor. They have been raised to believe obligation and honor are the same thing, and you don't. I told the court of the ascendancy that a promise enforced by hostages is not an agreement between equals. I told them that trading our people for resource rights was a transaction, not diplomacy, and that a transaction masquerading as an honor was still a transaction. I said this publicly. The resonance did something precise and controlled. My mother had me sedated 3 hours later. Rael sat with this. He thought about the manifest. He thought about Mira Calloway, who had known what was in the container and had told him cultural artifacts. He thought about Level 6 hegemony clearance being used to suppress a compliance query, which meant whoever had organized this transport had fingers deep inside the hegemony bureaucracy. He thought about his 912 cred marks and his thermal coupling. He thought about Kale. Where were you supposed to be delivered, he said. I do not know the specific facility, but Category 3 political assets under the Glass Accord are typically held at secondary compliance stations in the outer hegemony sectors, comfortable enough that the accord doesn't look like imprisonment, isolated enough that it functions as such. And whoever hired my fixer wanted me to deliver you there. Or, Seris said very carefully, whoever hired your fixer does not want me delivered to a hegemony facility at all, and told you it was a legitimate commission so that you would move me through checkpoints without triggering scrutiny, in which case my destination is considerably less comfortable than a compliance station. The hold was very quiet. Dex, Rael said. Run the delivery coordinates from the chip. Already done, Dex said. They resolved to a private facility in the Kelrath sector, no hegemony registry. The facility is registered to a shell company that routes through 3 separate intermediaries. The last traceable owner on record is a holding entity connected to the Vethara Syndicate. Seris said nothing. The resonance did something that Rael felt in the back of his throat. The Vethara Syndicate was not a government, it was not a diplomatic organization. It was a multi-species crime organization that had, over 50 years, built itself into a structure so thoroughly intertwined with legitimate commerce and hegemony bureaucracy that prosecution had become essentially theoretical. The Vethara dealt in everything that could be moved for profit. And a Category 3 political asset from the Tharan Ascendancy, the third daughter of the Ascendant herself, would be in the hands of the Vethara, not a prisoner. She would be leverage. She would be a card to play against both the hegemony and the ascendancy for as long as she remained useful. And when she stopped being useful, she would stop being anything at all. Mira sold me a kidnapping, Rael said. Mira may not have known the end point, Dex said, with what sounded like an effort toward fairness. She may have genuinely believed she was running a hegemony compliance transfer. Does that distinction matter? Seris asked. It was a good question. Rael turned it over. For Mira, maybe, he said. For you, no. For me, Seris said, with that precise, dry quality, very little that involves the people who make decisions about me has ever mattered in the way they intend it to. He heated a ration pack. He had no way to get it through the exchange port. It was too large. He sat on his cargo crate in the hold and ate it and told her what he was eating, 'cause it seemed wrong to eat in front of someone who was hungry and say nothing about it. She asked him questions. Precise, careful questions in the way of someone who was accustomed to gathering information as a survival mechanism. How large was the ship? What was their speed? What was their current position? How long until the delivery coordinates had them within hegemony enforcement range? He answered all of them honestly. She was quiet for a moment after each answer, and he realized she was calculating, not in a frantic way, in the way of someone who had learned to do their most important thinking in very small spaces. "You have not told me what you intend to do," she said. "I'm working on it. What are your options as you currently understand them?" He put down the empty ration pack. "I could continue to the delivery coordinates. That's the original commission. I get paid. You get delivered to people who will use you as leverage and probably eventually kill you when they're done. Yes. I could turn around and take you back to Port Vareth. Except I don't know if Vareth is safe for either of us at this point, and returning to a station with a hegemony compliance prisoner aboard is a crime that carries about 6 years in a hegemony facility. Yes. I could attempt to contact a hegemony enforcement body and explain that I was misled into transporting a glass accord political asset under false pretenses." He paused. "Except that whoever organized this transport has level 6 clearance and connections to the Vethara Syndicate, so the probability that I reach an enforcement body that isn't already involved is low." "Yes, or I figure out a fourth option." The resonance moved. It was a different quality than anything he'd felt from her yet. Still controlled, still precise, but underneath the control, something he would have struggled to name. Something like what happened to a held breath when it finally becomes possible to exhale. "Most people," Seris said slowly, "when they discover that their cargo is a glass accord prisoner, do not explore fourth options. They continue to the delivery point. Most people don't have decks finding them Vethara Shell Company registrations. Most people wouldn't care about the Vethara, even if they had the information." "True," Rael said. "Why do you care?" The hold was quiet. The mule thrummed around them. The drift moved past outside, dark and immense and old, and Rael sat with the question. "I had a brother," he said. "His name was Kale. He died 6 years ago on Tharis Prime during the early protests, before the Glass Accord." The resonance in the container shifted to something very still. "He believed in things," Rael continued. "He went to Tharis Prime because he believed that what was happening there was wrong and that human presence in the protests mattered, that it meant something for a species that wasn't Aethori to show up and say this is not right. He was 26 years old and he believed that completely. What happened to him? Hegemony compliance forces dispersed a march he was in. Non-lethal methods officially."
The incident report said 7 casualties.
Kale was a casualty. Silence. "He was my younger brother," Rael said. "He used to argue with me about every job I took. He'd say, 'Rael, you could be doing something that matters.' I'd say, 'Kale, I have rent.' He'd say, 'Rael, rent is not a reason to stop being a human being.' I'd say, 'Kale, human being requires food.' We argued about it until he died. And then I stopped arguing and started taking every job that would keep me alive and not asking what it meant." "And now you are asking," Seris said. "I am definitely asking." The resonance, that low, barely audible tone that he felt more than heard, moved through something he did not have a word for. It was not grief. It was not comfort. It was more like the way two instruments, hearing a common note, will vibrate in recognition of each other across a room. "There was a protest leader," Seris said very quietly, "on Tharis Prime. During the early demonstrations before the Glass Accord silenced everything. His name is in the Tharin Memorial Register. I put it there personally. The register is sealed now by order of the Ascendancy, but it exists." Rael said nothing. "I tried to stop the compliance forces that dispersed that march," Seris said. "I was 17 years old. I had no authority and no support, and what I said to the compliance director that day was recorded and presented to my mother as evidence that I was a destabilizing influence. It was one of 3 incidents cited when she signed the transfer order 11 months ago." A pause. "I failed. The march was dispersed. 7 casualties. I have carried those 7 names for 6 years. The hold was very quiet. Rael stood up slowly. He walked to the container and put his hand flat against its cold metal surface, which was a gesture that communicated nothing practically and everything in the way that mattered. "Your brother's name," Seris said. "Tell me his name." "Rael Voss." A very long pause. When she spoke again, her voice was low and precise and carrying harmonics that Rael felt in the base of his skull. "Rael Voss," she said. "It is in the register." Rael stood with his hand against the container wall and breathed. "Okay," he said finally. "Okay. We're not going to the delivery coordinates." A pause. Then very carefully, "What is the fourth option?" "I'm still working on it," he said. "But I'm working on it now. That's different from before." End of Part 2, Part 3. The long way around the tethered mule was not a fast ship. Rael had made a kind of peace with this over 3 years of ownership, or rather of custody, because the mule's original debt was still being serviced and would be for another 2 years, which meant he was paying for the privilege of being responsible for an aging Kirova-class cargo hauler with a temperamental starboard drive node and what Dex diplomatically called a vintage atmospheric recycling system. The mule was built for reliability over a long haul, not for speed, and she delivered on that promise with the stubbornness of something that had decided to be exactly what it was and had no interest in being argued with. Right now, not being fast was a significant tactical liability. Rael stood at the navigation console and looked at his options. He had pulled up a full sector map, the kind that included the unmonitored drift channels and fold lane markers that were not on official hegemony charts, the kind of map that took time and contacts to build and marked a person as operating in a specific category of commerce. The delivery coordinates were in the Kelrath sector, 4 hours at standard speed. Turning back to Port Vareth was 6 hours and had problems he'd already listed. There were 3 other waypoints within reasonable range. Vethara Station was off the map. Literally, it wasn't on official charts, and going anywhere near it with an undelivered Vethara package seemed like the kind of decision that would be brief. The Myrith outpost was 8 hours into the drift and ran on a rotating population of independent operators, which meant it was either perfectly safe or actively dangerous, depending on who was currently in residence. He flagged it as a contingency. The third option was the Vethara relay point that Dex had flagged earlier, the one where Mira's previous shipments had passed through. If that relay had suppressed a hegemony query, it meant someone there had both the clearance and the motivation to manage official attention, which could mean a hegemony-connected operative, or it could mean a Vethara asset, or it could mean something else entirely. "Deeks," he said, "I need to know if we're being tracked. I've been running passive scans since we cleared Vareth. No active targeting signals, no transponder pings from pursuit vessels. We are currently, as far as I can determine, invisible. As far as you can determine, which is considerably farther than most ships of this class. But yes, that's the qualifier. How long before someone at the delivery point starts wondering where their package is?" The Commission had a 6-hour delivery window. We're 2 hours in. 4 hours remain before failure to deliver generates a query. The query would go, based on the commission structure, to the fixer who arranged the transport, Mira, who would then need to decide whether to flag the non-delivery to her client or attempt to contact you first. Mira knows your communication pattern. She knows you do not respond to unsolicited contact during a run. She might wait another hour or 2 before escalating. So we have between 4 and 6 hours before someone with Vethara connections knows their package hasn't arrived. Broadly, yes. Rael pulled up the fold lane markers. Fold lanes were illegal. They exploited naturally occurring gravitational anomalies to create temporary passage shortcuts that bypassed hegemony traffic infrastructure, which the hegemony objected to, partly because it meant they couldn't monitor the traffic, and partly because fold lanes occasionally destabilized and turned the ships using them into briefly spectacular events. The mule wasn't rated for fold lane transit. Neither were most cargo haulers. He had used fold lanes exactly 4 times. He had emerged successfully from all 4. He chose to interpret this as data rather than luck, because interpreting it as luck would require acknowledging how thin the margin had been on 2 of the 4 occasions. "How far to the nearest fold lane entry point?" he said. Dex was quiet for exactly 2 seconds, which was a long time for Dex. "Rael, the mule's port drive coupling is operating at 73% efficiency. Fold transit puts significant stress on drive systems." "How far?" 47 minutes at current speed. It exits into the edge of the Vareth expanse. That's 3 sectors from hegemony enforcement range and 8 hours from a location I have flagged as potentially relevant. What location? Is a Tharan Liberation Front listening post at coordinates in the Vareth expanse that I identified in archived protest communications 3 years ago. I have no current confirmation that it is still active, but the TLF has maintained operations in that region historically. Rael turned from the console and looked at the cargo hold hatch. DX. Is Seris awake? Her vital signs suggest full cognitive function. She has been still for the past 40 minutes, which may indicate deliberate stillness or sleep, but the neural harmonic activity I can detect through the container walls suggests the former. He went down to the hold. She was awake. I have options, Rael said, sitting back on his cargo crate. None of them are good. I'm going to tell you what they are, and you're going to tell me what you know. Agreed, Seris said. The fold lane, the Vareth expanse, the TLF listening post that might or might not still exist. The 6-hour window before Vethara connected people started looking for them. He told it plain, without softening, because she had told him the first honest sentence she'd heard in 11 months was his admission that he hadn't decided yet, and he thought she deserved the same quality of honesty in everything that followed. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. The Tharan Liberation Front, she said. Your ship's AI found this information in archived protest communications. Yes, 3 years ago. Yes. The TLF maintained 7 active stations in the Outer Drift at the time of the Glass Accord. 4 were identified and shut down by hegemony compliance operations in the following 18 months. I knew the locations of all 7. A pause. I have not been in a position to share that information with anyone until now. The resonance shifted, controlled but alive with something. The listening post in the Vareth expanse is one of the 3 that was never identified. I cannot confirm whether it is still operational, but TLF cells are instructed to maintain a position for a minimum of 5 years before considering abandonment. It has been 3 years since the Accord, if they have followed protocol. Someone's home, Rael said. Someone may be home. He stood up. Fold lane in 47 minutes. I'm going to need to know one thing before we try it. Ask it. Can you open the container from the inside? You said the lock responds to your resonance. I need to know if you can do it, because if we come out of a fold transit with a damaged drive and need to move fast, I can't be trying to cut through hegemony compliance alloy. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the ones before it. Those had been thinking silences. This one was a silence that held something deeper. He felt it in his chest, the resonance shifting into a frequency he hadn't encountered yet, something low and careful and slow, like the sound a bridge makes when the load on it is right at the edge of its tolerance. I could open it now, Seris said. The harmonic sequence is not complicated. I have known how to generate it since the first day. I have had my hands free of restraints for approximately 6 hours. The compliance manacles were calibrated for a standard sedation duration, and I was under for longer than they anticipated, so my hands had already been free by the time you spoke to me. Rael processed this. You've been able to open the container since we left Port Vareth, he said. Technically, yes. But you haven't. No, why? The resonance moved through something complex, not evasion, calculation of how to say something true and difficult accurately. Because, Seris said, for the past 6 years, every closed door has had a person on the other side of it who decided what would happen to me. Every sealed room has been a negotiation that I was not permitted to participate in. Every lock has been someone else's tool for managing my existence. A pause. When I woke up in this container and heard your voice, I made a choice to speak with you, rather than to simply leave. Because opening that door was the first choice I had available to me in 11 months. And I chose to use it as a door for listening, rather than for running. Because I did not know yet whether you were the kind of person worth listening to. Rael sat with this. And now, he said. Now, she said, you have told me about your brother and about the 4th option, and you have been honest with me about every risk in your plan, even though the risks are mostly mine to carry.
So yes, I can open the container.
But, he said, because there was a but in the cadence, The resonance settled into something very quiet and very precise. "The compliance manacles are still attached," she said. "I can open the door. I cannot remove the manacles without the authorization code. I will walk out of this container into your cargo hold in hegemony restraints, which means I will be free in all the ways that matter least and bound in all the ways that matter most. And I have been in that precise condition for most of my life, so I am practiced at it. But I wanted you to understand it before I opened the door." Rael was quiet for a moment. He looked at the container's locking panel. He thought about hegemony compliance manacles. He thought about authorization codes he didn't have. "Open the door," he said, "and then tell me everything you know about how compliance manacles work, because I'm going to find a way to get them off you. That's not a promise I'm making to make you feel better. That's a statement of intent based on the fact that I am reasonably good at getting into and out of things that I'm not supposed to get into and out of." The silence that followed lasted about 4 seconds. Then, from within the container, he heard a sound, low and harmonic and precise, a resonance that built and shifted through 3 distinct frequencies in under 2 seconds, an organic lock tumbler turning, a biological key that was indistinguishable from the person it belonged to. The locking panel clicked. The container door swung open. The compliance manacles were 2 connected bands of hegemony compliance alloy, fitted around her wrists with a connecting length that allowed approximately 30 centimeters of movement between them. The alloy was warm gray and seamless and had a faint textural marking on its surface that Rael recognized as the hegemony standard compliance identifier, the serial number and custody code that, if scanned, would report her status and location to a hegemony compliance relay. The relay function had been disabled by whatever field they were in, out here in the drift, which was the only reason Dex hadn't been flagging compliance pings since the moment she stepped out of the container. She sat at the fold-out table in the mule's small crew compartment, which was approximately the size of a generous closet, and was currently serving as both galley and situation room, and she ate the ration pack he heated for her with the focused efficiency of someone who was profoundly hungry and had decided that dignity and hunger were not incompatible. He watched her hands around the ration pack and thought about what she'd said. "Free in all the ways that matter least and bound in all the ways that matter most. Tell me about the manacles," he said. She looked at the manacles. Hegemony Compliance Standard, Series 14, issued to Category 3 and above assets under the Glass Accord. They are keyed to an authorization code held by the designated compliance director for the asset in question. She paused. "My compliance director is a hegemony official named Vareth Sen." "Do you know Vareth Sen?" "I know of him. He is senior enough to have Level 6 clearance. He is also the person who would be contacted if my delivery fails to reach its destination." Rael filed Vareth Sen under things he needed to think about later. The manacles. "Is there a physical mechanism I can attack?" "The alloy. The alloy is rated to resist cutting tools up to and including high-grade plasma cutters. The connecting link is flexible but cannot be severed without the same. The locking mechanisms at each wrist do not have a physical bypass." She turned them over in her hands. However, she held the left manacle up. On the inner surface, where it met the skin of her wrist, there was a small indicator, a single point of light, currently dark. When the authorization code is entered, this indicator activates and the manacles release. But there is a secondary protocol that most compliance officers are not aware of because it was implemented in Series 14 as a diplomatic concession to the Aethori delegation during the Glass Accord negotiations. The Aethori argued that holding an individual in physical restraints that could not be removed by any act of the individual's own will was a violation of the Accord's own language, which guaranteed the dignity of political wards. It was a technical argument and was almost entirely rejected. But one provision survived. A Series 14 manacle can be released by a sustained harmonic resonance from the wearer if that resonance meets a specific emotional threshold, recognized by the lock's biosensor as genuine autonomous will. Rael looked at the manacles. He looked at her hands. "You can unlock them yourself," he said. "No," she said, "I cannot, not yet." He waited. "The sensor is calibrated," she said carefully, "to detect genuine autonomous will. Specifically the resonance pattern associated with a person choosing freely, Not under duress, not in fear, not in reaction to pressure. The lock was designed this way deliberately, to prevent a ward from being coerced into producing the resonance to serve someone else's purpose. It is only triggered by the genuine harmonic signature of a person who is choosing, entirely of their own accord, to be free, and you can't produce that. The resonance in the air around her was very quiet and very still. I have never in my life made a choice that was entirely my own. My betrothal was arranged at the age of 4. My education was designed to produce a specific kind of mind. My protests against the glass accord were, in their own way, reactive, a response to what was being done rather than an expression of what I wanted. Even opening your container door was a choice made in reaction to your presence. She paused. The lock knows the difference. It is more sophisticated than most people assume. Well, Rael sat with this for a long time. He thought about the kind of mind that had designed a lock keyed to genuine autonomy. He thought about the Vethara diplomat who had argued for that provision in the glass accord negotiations, whether they had believed it would work or whether it had simply been the best available move in an already losing negotiation. He thought about what it meant to live in a life so thoroughly managed by others that even your own nervous system couldn't generate the signal for free choice. "We have 20 minutes to the fold lane," he said. "Let's get through that first." She looked at him across the small table, and the resonance shifted into something he was beginning to learn the shape of. Not quite trust. Something that preceded trust, the space that trust occupies before it arrives. "Yes," she said, "let's." Fold lane transit was not pleasant even under ideal conditions. Rael had described it to Cale once. On one of the rare occasions his brother had come aboard the mule, like being turned inside out by something that doesn't know what inside is. Cale had laughed and called it poetry. Rael had said it was description. The reality was a 14-second subjective experience during which the ship's hull stress sensors registered patterns that the structural integrity reports afterward refused to fully enumerate, and during which every organic being aboard experienced a sensation that their brain attempted to categorize and failed, settling instead for a general bodily conviction that something fundamentally important had briefly stopped being true. Seris handled it with the stillness of someone who had decided in advance to simply endure and then reassess. She gripped the crew compartment handholds with both manacled hands and made no sound and was, as best Rael could tell, absolutely still while the universe briefly forgot its own rules. He was in the pilot's seat, hands on the manual controls, because if something went wrong with the drive during transit, he would need to respond in the first 2 seconds, and an AI's response time was not the limiting factor there. His own pattern recognition was. His hands knew this ship's responses the way they knew nothing else, which was a fact about his life that he tried not to think about. The fold collapsed. The mule lurched, hard, to starboard, a yaw correction that Rael caught with a reflexive counterburn, and then they were in the Vareth expanse, and the navigation console was showing their new position, and the drift was different here. Colder, darker. The nearest star was a dim yellow point 2 light hours away. "Drive status," Rael said. "Port drive operating at 61%, Deck said, down from 73. Coupling stress estimate was accurate. I want it on record that I calculated that. On record. Anything following us, no pursuit contacts. We are currently off the main drift lanes. However," a pause, "Rael, I'm picking up a long-range scan pulse. It's passive, very broad spectrum. It's not a pursuit scan. It is the signature of a vessel that is looking for something rather than tracking something. Range beyond my precise localization capability. It is very faint. But it is there." Rael turned this over. "A passive broad-spectrum scan at range. That was not hegemony enforcement procedure. Enforcement would use targeted transponder pings. That was the signature of a ship that had been told to look and had been given a region rather than a location. A ship hunting." "Begin TLF contact protocol," he said. Rael, Deck said. "I have no confirmed TLF contact protocol. I have the archived listening post coordinates. I can transmit a hailing signal on the frequency bands historically used by TLF communication, but I have no way to confirm that. Do it. And mask the transmission as background noise. Use the drift static filter." That will reduce the signal strength significantly. It will also mean that if anyone other than a TLF receiver picks it up, it looks like instrument noise. Yes, transmitting. He went back to the crew compartment. Seris was standing. The 14-second fold had not put her on the floor, which he noted as evidence of either very good balance or a very high tolerance for what her body told her. She had braced herself in the corner of the compartment and was now unbracing methodically, the manacles catching the work-grade light. "We're in the Vareth expanse," Rael said. "Transmitted a hail on TLF frequencies. We have an unknown vessel scanning the region at range. I don't know if it's hunting us or hunting generally." "If Vareth has been contacted about a failed delivery," Seris said, "he would not use hegemony enforcement channels immediately. He would not want to generate official record of my location or his involvement in this transport. He would use private contractors, a Vethara compliance ship, possibly his own vessel. He has one." She moved to the crew compartment's small porthole, not a viewport, just a secondary atmospheric sensor cover with a small transparent section, and looked at the dark. "Vareth was assigned as my compliance director 14 months ago, 2 months before my mother signed the transfer order. He came to Tharis Prime personally. He sat across from me in the court reception room and spoke to me for 40 minutes about the necessity of the Glass Accord and the role that people like me could play in ensuring its success." A pause. "He spoke to me the way one speaks to a piece in a strategy, accurately representing what it can do, having no interest in what it is. Is he dangerous?" She turned from the porthole. The resonance was flat and clear. "He is dangerous in the way that organized, certain people are dangerous. He believes completely in what he does. He believes the Glass Accord is necessary for stability, that political wards are a reasonable cost, and that my particular resistance to the system is a threat that must be managed. He is not cruel. He is something more difficult than cruel." A pause. "He is right about some things and wrong about the things that matter, and he will not change his mind, because his mind was built to maintain conviction." "How close does he need to be to get a compliance lock signal from your manacles?" Her eyes dropped to the manacles, then came back up. "The standard relay range is approximately 2 light minutes. In the drift, with reduced interference, possibly 3. And if he gets within range, he will know exactly where I am, and that I am not at a Vethara facility." Rael pulled up the navigation console from the crew compartment secondary panel. The passive scan pulse was still there, faint, at the edge of the detection range. He pulled up the drive status, port drive at 61%. Not enough for another fold transit. The coupling would fail and then they'd be adrift on secondary drives, which would reduce their speed to approximately walking pace by cosmic standards. He needed time to let the coupling cool and restabilize before they could safely transit again. "Dex," he said, "the passive scan. Can you estimate its position?" "Working with significant uncertainty. Based on the pulse pattern and signal attenuation, I estimate the source is approximately 4.5 light minutes from our current position and moving, slowly, but moving. Direction broadly toward our current position. But broadly is doing a lot of work in that sentence. The scan is wide. It could be quartering the sector methodically, 4.5 light minutes. Moving, if it was doing a standard sector quarter pattern, it might pass within compliance lock range in anywhere from 3 hours to 12, depending on the size of the pattern." "How long until the fold coupling can safely sustain another transit?" Rael asked. 2 hours minimum. 3 would be safer. "How long until TLF per post responds to the hail, if it's going to respond?" "No way to estimate. Could be minutes, could be hours, could be never." Rael looked at Seris. "We wait," he said. She nodded. "We wait." The resonance shifted into something careful and steady. "You should sleep. I will watch the long-range scan and call you if it changes." "You don't sleep?" "Aetheri sleep cycles are longer than human cycles, and I have not been in a position to choose my sleep times for 11 months. I will not sleep yet." She looked at him with that flat, clear quality she had in her eyes when she was being precise. "You have been awake since before Port Vareth, and you will need your cognition functional." "Sleep. I don't usually take instruction well, I know. You have the bearing of someone who makes a virtue of self-reliance." But I have been observing you for approximately 8 hours now, and your reaction time on the fold correction was slower than it should have been. I noticed the correction. I also noticed that you caught it. The gap between noticing and catching is going to narrow if you do not rest. He looked at her. 3 hours, he said. You wake me at any change. Any change, not just the big ones, any change, yes, Rael. He went to the bunk alcove. He lay down with his clothes on and his boots on, which was not comfortable and was precisely the level of comfort available to someone in his current situation, and he closed his eyes. He lay there for about 90 seconds thinking about the fold coupling, and Vareth Sen, and the passive scan pulse, and Mira Calloway, and 912 cred marks. He fell asleep in the way that people who have been awake too long fall asleep, absolutely and immediately, like a light going out. He woke to Dex's voice. Not alarmed. Dex had a specific tone for alarmed, and this was not it. This was the tone Dex used for significant developments that required prompt attention. Rael, 2 hours, 17 minutes. The TLF post has responded. He was upright and moving to the crew compartment before the sentence was fully finished. Seris was at the secondary console, not sleeping, as stated. She looked up when he came in. The resonance in the air was alert and different from before, higher, quicker, the harmonic equivalent of someone who had been very still for a long time and had just received news. "What's the contact?" he said. "Text only on the masked frequency," Dex said. Continuation handshake and confirms it is a genuine TLF protocol. The message is short. Read it. Who are you and what do you want? That is the complete message. Rael looked at Seris. She said something then that he hadn't heard before, a sequence of ethery harmonics, brief and precise. In her voice it was not quite speech and not quite song. It was the sound of a tuning fork finding the correct note. "Can you transmit that?" he said to Dex. "I can approximate it with the audio transmission system, with caveats about frequency fidelity. Transmit it." He looked at Seris. "What was that?" "A phrase in Old Tharan. Approximately. I am the voice that was silenced, and the silence has not yet stopped speaking." She paused. "It is from the early TLF founding documents. A phrase that would have no meaning to anyone who had not read those documents or worked directly with the movement." They waited. 40 seconds. The response came back in text, and this time it was longer. "Coordinates following. Come in on descent pattern 7. Lights off. Drive at minimum. Do not transmit again until you are within visual range. We will have you covered." "How many aboard?" Rael replied. 2. 1 is the asset." The response: "Understood. Come now." Part 4. Vethara Station Relay and the cover that held the Tharan Liberation Front Sareth listening post was built into the hull of a decommissioned hegemony survey vessel that had been reported as lost in a drive failure 9 years prior. The report had been accurate. The drive failure had been genuine. What the report had not included was that the crew, 4 TLF operatives who had been running intelligence gathering under hegemony cover, had guided the dead vessel to this precise location in the Sarath expanse and had spent the following 3 months converting it from a survey vessel into something that was, effectively, an ear pressed against the wall of hegemony space. It ran on a contained fusion cell that had another 12 years of fuel. It had a crew of 3. It smelled of close quarters and the particular fatigue that comes from being alert for months at a stretch, in a place where nothing happens and then something does. The person who met them at the docking collar was a Grell female named Yath Osso, who had the compressed, watchful build of someone who had been doing difficult things in small spaces for a long time. She looked at Seris and the manacles with an expression that moved through recognition and grief, and a very controlled anger, in approximately 2 seconds before settling into the practical. "We have an override kit," she said. "Not for the Series 14 lock mechanism. Nothing short of hegemony authorization cracks that. But we can block the compliance relay signal from reaching outside this vessel." "That buys us time," Rael said. "Not a solution." "No." Yath Osso looked at Seris directly. "You are her, the Ascendant's 3rd daughter." "I am," Seris said. "We have been trying to locate you for 8 months. We knew you had been transported out of Tharis Prime, but we lost the trail at the secondary holding facility." She paused. "Your sister Mira." "My sister is compliant," Seris said precisely. She always has been. She is not TLF. Not her, Mira Calloway, the fixer. She is TLF. Rael went very still. He heard in the sudden quiet the piece of this he had been missing. Mira Calloway had given him a job. Mira Calloway had known what was in the container. Mira Calloway worked for the Tharan Liberation Front, not for the Vethara, and the entire commission, the sealed container, the cultural artifacts manifest, the triple rate, had not been a Vethara operation at all. It had been an extraction dressed as a legitimate smuggling run. She didn't tell me, he said. She couldn't, Yath also said. We have a Vethara asset inside our network, we don't know who. Any information about the real purpose of the run had to be kept to the minimum number of people. She chose a courier she trusted to figure it out. She could have just told me. Would you have taken the job? He thought about it. Honestly, I don't know, he said. She thought you'd get here, Yath also said. And you did. She looked at the manacles again, the code. We have contacts inside the Hegemony Compliance Network. We've been working for 3 years to identify authorization codes for Glass Accord assets. We have 70% of the Category 3 compliance codes. 70%, Seris said. Yes. Yath also met her eyes. Do you want to know if yours is in that 70%? The resonance in the air around Seris went very still. No, she said. Yath looked at her with a question. If my code is in that 70%, Seris said slowly, it means this door could have been opened for me 8 months ago. It means every month I spent in that holding facility was a month during which the answer existed and was simply in the wrong hands. Her voice was entirely level. The resonance was absolutely controlled. I need a moment before I am willing to sit with that, so no, not yet. Yath nodded once. She understood the shape of that grief. Rael could see it in how she held herself. He said nothing. He was learning the specific kind of silence that was more useful than speech. The Voraxen ship, he said instead. Passive scan at range. We need to know if he's triangulating. Yath moved to the post's tactical panel. She was quiet for 30 seconds. Then, he's here. Vareth-class enforcement vessel, running dark on secondary drives. He entered the Sareth expanse through the main drift lane 14 minutes after you went through your fold. She looked at the readouts. He is doing a systematic search grid, not random. He has a search protocol that will bring him within relay range of this post in approximately 90 minutes. He knows she's here. He knows she's somewhere in the Sareth expanse. The fold lane exit signature is detectable if you know what to look for and arrive within a few hours. He knows what he's looking for. A pause. If she's in this post when he gets within relay range, he gets the ping, Rael said. He knows she's here. He calls for hegemony backup and this whole post is compromised. Or he handles it himself, Seris said. Voraxen would prefer to handle it himself. Official hegemony involvement would require him to explain why a Glass Accord political ward was being transported to a Vethara facility. That is not a conversation he can have in open record. So he deals with the post and then files a recovery report with a different story, Rael said. Yes, then we need to move, Rael said. DX, drive status, port drive at 78%. The 2-hour rest was enough for partial recovery. I would recommend against another fold transit, but the standard drive is functional. Good enough. Yath also. Do you have a safe route out of the Sareth expanse that avoids the grid Sen is running? She was already at the charts. There is a drift channel to the rimward edge of the expanse that his current grid leaves open for approximately 40 more minutes. After that, his search pattern closes it. She looked up. Where are you going? I don't know yet, Rael said. Rael, Seris said. He looked at her. I know where we're going, she said. But you need to decide if you're willing. Part 5. The choice the decision Seris put to him was this. The Hegemony Council's compliance headquarters maintained a public-facing records interface, a legal accountability measure that was mostly theoretical in practice but technically existent. Glass Accord political assets could petition for review of their status through the public interface. The petition went to a review board. The review board had never, in 3 years of the Glass Accord's existence, overturned a compliance designation. But the review board was required to log all petitions and their outcomes in the public record, which meant that if a petition was submitted by Seris Vale Tharan, it would exist in a public record that could be accessed by Tharan media organizations, by the 17 opposition voices still operating on Tharis Prime, by every TLF cell in the drift, and by the 12 Aethori council members who had abstained on the Glass Accord vote and had spent 3 years waiting for something to happen. A petition required physical presence at a Hegemony Council public interface terminal. The nearest one was at Vethara Station, not the Vethara Syndicate. The Vethara Way Station, which was separately administered and happened to share a name. One of those historical coincidences that made life in the Outer Drift consistently confusing. Vethara Way Station was neutral ground by treaty. No enforcement action could be initiated within its boundaries by any hegemony member state. It was the kind of neutrality that was maintained primarily because too many different interested parties found it useful. If I file a petition from Vethara Way Station, Seris said, the filing enters public record immediately. Voraxena cannot suppress it without creating a record of suppression, which is its own kind of evidence. He cannot remove me from Vethara without violating the Neutral Ground Treaty, which requires 12 Council consensus. He cannot touch you while you are on Vethara Station, and my petition, my words in the record, becomes the first time in 3 years that a Glass Accord political ward has spoken publicly in any official forum. What does the petition say, whatever I choose it to say? The resonance was precise and clear. For the first time, whatever I choose. Rael looked at the charts. Vethara Way Station was 3 hours from the Sareth Expanse on Standard Drive. The route Yathoso had identified as open for 40 minutes cut directly toward it. Sen's ship was 90 minutes from relay range, which meant that if they left in the next 10 minutes, they would be through the open drift channel before Sen's grid closed it. They would have a head start of approximately 30 to 40 minutes on Sen's pursuit, assuming he was fast enough to track them through the channel. The mule was not fast. She was, however, built for sustained cruise, and Sen would need to collapse his search grid before pursuit, which cost time. They might make Vethara Way Station. They might not. DX, Rael said. What does the mule need? To make Vethara Way Station ahead of Voraxen's enforcement vessel, assuming he identifies our route within 15 minutes of our departure and pursues at maximum enforcement speed? Yes. We need everything the port drive has and about 20 minutes of luck. A pause, which, historically, we have been able to generate when necessary. Rael looked at Seris. She looked back. The resonance was quiet. Not calm. Calm was a kind of settled distance. This was something else. This was presence. A person being entirely terribly present in the moment they were in. I have not asked you to do this, she said. I am presenting it as an option. The risk is largely yours. I am already at maximum risk. You have a ship and a life and the option to drop me at this post and fly away. I know. The Tharan Liberation Front can take responsibility for me from this point. Yath Osso and her team would have 90 minutes to get you out of the Sareth Expanse before Sen is in relay range, Rael said, which is tighter than the window I have, and they don't know the drift channels on the route to Vethara the way I do, Rael. Also, he said, and I want to be clear that I'm saying this not as a strategy but as a fact. You told me my brother's name is in the register. You put it there yourself. And I have been carrying him as a weight for 6 years, and I am going to do the next right thing and see what that does to the weight. The resonance in the air around her shifted through something that was not quite describable in any human emotional vocabulary. He felt it in the base of his ribs. It was the harmonic equivalent of something opening. Not dramatically, not all at once. The way a door opens when someone on the other side of it has finally decided to reach for the handle. There is one more thing, Seris said. Her voice was low and very controlled. If we reach Vethara and I file the petition, if the words go into the public record, if Voraxen is forced to respond officially. She paused. It may not be enough. The review board has never overturned a designation. The petition may be logged and dismissed and become simply one more entry in a file that no one reads. Yes, Rael said. And you understand that this is the probable outcome. Yes, and you are still willing. Seris, he said. If the probable outcome were enough to stop me, I would have delivered you to the coordinates. She was quiet for a moment. 30 seconds, she said then, to do something. I need 30 seconds. He gave her the space. He turned to Yathoso, who was already preparing the docking release. He gave Dex the departure prep order. He ran the fold channel heading in his head, mapping the route against what he knew of the drift. Behind him in the crew compartment, he heard the sound. Low, sustained, building through harmonics in a sequence that was deliberate and intricate, not the lock sequence from the container, which had been quick and precise. This was something different, something slower, something that was working through a resistance he could feel in the air, a pressure that built and held and held and held. He turned around. The indicator light on the left manacle came on, a tiny point of light, blue, bright. The manacle opened, not released by a code, not cracked by a tool. The lock had done what it was designed to do. The right manacle followed 4 seconds later. Both fell away and hit the floor of the crew compartment with a sound that was, for a piece of hegemony compliance equipment, surprisingly small. Seris stood with her wrists bare for the first time in 11 months, and the resonance in the air around her was the most complex thing he had ever felt with his sternum. He did not have words for it. He did not reach for words. Yathoso was crying, quietly, in the way of a person who is trying very hard not to, and has mostly succeeded. Dex said nothing, which was its own kind of eloquence. "Let's go," Seris said. Part 6. The tethered mule runs. They cleared the Vareth, expanse through the drift channel with 11 minutes to spare before Sen's grid closed it. Rael had the drives at 92%. Not the 100% that the port drive's compromised coupling made inadvisable, and the mule ran with the specific determination of a ship that had been asked to do something difficult and had decided to do it. He could feel the drive through his boots. The thrum was different at 92%, more urgent. The ship had opinions at this speed and expressed them through vibration patterns that he had learned to read the way he had learned to read nothing else. A slight asymmetry in the port drive tone. The thermal coupling working harder than it should. The fold nav system cycling through its self-check protocol with a frequency that suggested it was nervous, if a navigation system could be nervous. Dex tracked Sen's ship. "He is out of the search grid," Dex reported. "He has identified our exit track. He is accelerating." "How fast is maximum?" "He is a Vareth-class enforcement vessel. His top speed is approximately 15% higher than our current speed." "How long before he closes to relay range?" "At current trajectories, he reaches relay range of Vethara Station approximately 20 minutes before we do." Seris was in the co-pilot's seat. She had asked to sit there. He had not asked why. She watched the navigation readout with the same focused precision she brought to everything. "If he reaches relay range before we reach Vethara," she said, "he can still scan for my compliance signal." "The manacles are on the floor in the crew compartment," Rael said. "I know. He will scan for them and find them on your ship and know exactly where we are. He does not need me in the manacles to track the hardware." A pause. "He also does not need to reach Vethara Station to act. He can intercept us in transit. In transit, attacking a civilian vessel in drift space is a violation of Hegemony Code 714, yes. Sen is a man who believes in law. He will not attack us in open drift." She paused. "But he will get close, and he will use the proximity to transmit a binding compliance order to this ship. A Level 6 clearance compliance order requires any vessel receiving it to cease movement and prepare for boarding. It is enforceable against any ship operating in hegemony-adjacent space. The drift is not. The definition of hegemony-adjacent space in the compliance code is any space within effective transmission range of a hegemony enforcement vessel." She looked at him steadily. "It was written that way deliberately." Rael looked at the navigation readout. Sen's ship closing at 15% higher than their speed. Vethara Station, 2 hours and 19 minutes away. 20 minutes before they arrived, Sen would be in relay range, which meant 20 minutes before they arrived, they would receive a binding compliance order to stop and prepare for boarding. "Can we jump?" Rael said. "Port drive coupling will not survive another fold transit," Dex said. "Not at current temperature." "How long to cool sufficiently?" "An hour and 40 minutes at minimum. Longer if we maintain this speed." "Can we reach Vethara in a route that keeps us outside Sen's relay range?" "There is no such route." The Sereth expanse to Vethara transit does not have a geometry that avoids relay range if the pursuing vessel is faster than us. A pause. There is, however, one option I have not mentioned. Say it. The relay range of a hegemony enforcement vessel is approximately 3 light minutes. The legal jurisdiction of Vethara Way Station neutral ground extends to a half-light-minute radius around the station. If we can reach that radius before Sen reaches relay range, he can't issue a binding compliance order inside Vethara jurisdiction. Vethara Neutral Ground Treaty supersedes Hegemony Code, correct. The window is approximately 12 minutes, based on current trajectories. If we increase our speed beyond 92%, the port drive coupling. Yes, Rael put his hands on the drive controls. He felt the coupling's resistance through the controls. The mule was not young. She had been running for 11 years on drives that had been maintained adequately, which was not the same as optimally. The thermal coupling on the port drive was a component that was rated for stress levels he was about to exceed. If it held, they made the Vethara radius. If it failed, they lost the port drive, reduced to secondary drives, and then ran them down in approximately 40 minutes. "Seris," he said. She looked at him. "I'm going to push the port drive to 100%. The coupling may fail. If it fails, we lose the drive and Sen catches us. If it holds, we reach Vethara neutral ground before he can issue a binding compliance order." She looked at the navigation readout. She looked at her bare wrists. She looked at him. "Do it," she said. He pushed the drive to 100%. The mule shook. Not a mechanical shudder, the kind of shake that moves through a whole ship when the drives are asked for everything and the drives are arguing about it. The thrum through his boots went from urgent to insistent. The thermal coupling temperature gauge climbed. The asymmetry in the port drive tone deepened. "Coupling temperature at 82% of rated maximum and climbing," Dex said. "I know. At 90% of rated maximum, the coupling has a—" "I know, Dex. 63% probability of failure at 90%. 47 at—"
"I know."
Rael kept his hands on the controls. The controls felt alive in the way that controls only feel alive when the machine behind them is at its limit. He could feel every vibration the mule was making. He knew this ship. He knew which vibrations were complaint and which were warning. He was listening in the way that he had learned to listen to machines, the way Kale had learned to listen to people. "Sen is transmitting," Dex said, "directed at us. He is inside relay range, the manacles. He will have their position in approximately 60 seconds. Can you jam the relay signal from the manacles? I can create interference. I cannot guarantee blocking the signal. Create the interference. Creating. Coupling at 86% of rated maximum." The Vethara Way Station marker was on the navigation readout. The neutral ground radius, the 12-minute window had become 9, had become 7. "Sen's binding compliance order incoming," Dex said. "He is transmitting on all hegemony registered frequencies. We are technically within hegemony adjacent space in the order." "Log it as received," Rael said. "Don't stop." "Rael, a binding compliance order is not enforceable inside Vethara jurisdiction. Log it as received and note the timestamp relative to our position when we receive it. I want the record to show exactly where we were when that order was transmitted." Silence. Then, logging, coupling at 90%. The probability of failure at 90% was 63%. He kept his hands on the controls. The mule shook. The thrum in his boots was nearly painful. He was asking this old, tired, reliable ship to do something it was not rated for, and the ship was doing it. And he felt something for the ship that was not quite the word he reached for, but was adjacent to it. Coupling at 91. Coupling at 92. The thrum changed, not failure. He'd heard drive failure once, on a different ship, on a run that had ended badly. Failure sounded like a sound stopping. This was different. This was a sound finding a new register. A higher, harder frequency that meant the coupling was past its rated maximum and had decided to continue operating anyway, the way very old, very well broken-in components sometimes did, through sheer accumulated memory of function. "Coupling at 94% and holding," Dex said. The AI's voice had something in it that Rael would have called disbelief in a human context. "It is holding." "Yeah," Rael said. "We are entering the Vethara neutral ground radius," Dex said. In 30 seconds. Sen's transmission continued, the binding compliance order, broadcasting on all frequencies. The mule received it and logged it and kept moving. 30 seconds. 15. We are inside the Vethara neutral ground radius, Dex said. The compliance order has no jurisdiction here. Vorak Sen's vessel is decelerating. He cannot follow without triggering an incident that requires 12 Council consensus, Seris said very quietly. Yes. Rael brought the drives back to standard cruise. The shaking stopped, the thrum settled. He ran a damage assessment on the port drive coupling and found that it had operated at 94% of rated maximum for 11 minutes and had then, apparently, decided that was fine, and it was fine with being fine. He let out a breath. He said, "The binding compliance order. Timestamp relative to our position. We received it at a range of 2 light minutes, 47 seconds from our position. At that moment, our position was 1 light minute, 12 seconds outside the Vethara neutral ground radius. A compliance order issued at that range at our relative velocity. Was it transmitted to us before we crossed into neutral ground or after? The transmission began before we crossed into neutral ground. But the binding effect of a compliance order, under Hegemony Code 714, is contingent on receipt at the vessel's registered transponder address, which requires the signal to complete its transmission. The signal completed during our transit of the radius boundary." A pause. "There is a strong legal argument that the order was not binding at the moment of completion. There's also a strong legal argument that it was. Yes, but an ambiguous legal situation at Vethara Way Station, with a public compliance petition about to be filed by a Glass Accord political asset, and a hegemony enforcement vessel sitting outside neutral ground radius with no legal path forward. That is a situation that benefits from ambiguity in our favor." Seris was looking at the viewports. Vethara Way Station's bulk was visible ahead. Not visually, this was the drift, but on the navigation readout, its beacon steady and neutral. She was looking at the readout with her bare wrists in her lap. "He will wait," she said, "outside the radius. When I leave the station, if I leave the station, he will be there." "Yes," Rael said. "Then we need to give him something to wait for. That costs him more than it costs us." Part 7. What Seris chose the Hegemony Council Public Interface Terminal at Vethara Way Station was in the station's administrative district, which was the least dramatic name for the most consequential room on the station. It looked like what it was, a bureaucratic necessity. Smooth walls, the Hegemony insignia on the far panel, the dull glow of a public record interface terminal that processed perhaps a dozen legitimate requests per year and had been installed at Vethara specifically because the Neutral Ground Treaty required it. The station administrator, a Grell male named Osek, who had been managing Vethara's neutrality for 14 years with the air of someone who had seen most things and found the majority of them less interesting than advertised, looked at Seris's bare wrists and then at Rael and then at the terminal and made the calculation that people who have been doing complicated things for 14 years make, that this was going to be one of the ones worth watching. He unlocked the terminal. He stepped back. Seris sat down at it. She sat there for a moment without moving. The room was quiet. The terminal was quiet. Outside the way station's hull, 2 light minutes away, Vorak Sen's enforcement vessel was sitting at the boundary of neutral ground, waiting with the patience of a man who was very certain of what was eventually going to happen. "Rael," Seris said. He was standing behind her. "Yes, stay here," she said. "While I do this, stay here. I'm not going anywhere." She turned to the terminal. She filed the petition. It was not, as petitions go, a short document. It was precise and detailed and absolutely legally constructed. She had been educated in Tharan court procedure since she could read, and she understood the language of official discourse the way she understood harmonic resonance, as a medium through which truth could be either contained or transmitted. She chose to transmit. She documented the Glass Accord negotiations in the specific detail that an eyewitness who had sat in the chamber possessed. She documented the 7 casualties of the protest march on Tharis Prime by name. She documented her own transfer order, the falsified manifest, the Vethara Syndicate delivery coordinates, and the compliance director, who had organized her transport outside official channels. She documented the Series 14 Manacle's secondary protocol and her own experience of what it meant to live in a life so thoroughly managed by others that her own nervous system could not generate the resonance for free choice until she encountered, in a cargo hold in the middle of the drift, a human smuggler who was honest about not having decided yet. She put that in the record. She put Rael Voss in the record by name as a witness and a participant and the human being who had asked what her name was and then used it. She put Rael Voss in the record, not as a casualty number, by name and age and the thing he had believed that had brought him to Tharis Prime. She put 7 names in the record. One of them was Rael Voss. The other 6 were A3 citizens who had also been on that march. She submitted the petition. The terminal logged it. The timestamp appeared. The record number appeared. Simultaneously, the petition went to 3 places: the Hegemony Council Review Board, the Tharan Ascendancy Official Correspondence Register, and the Public Access Archive. The Public Access Archive was where hegemony opposition media monitored constantly, because public petitions were among the few official documents that could not be suppressed without a logged suppression order, which was itself public record. The terminal showed petition submitted. Record reference 7741 Vale Tharan. Public access active. The administrator, Osok, was looking at his own secondary screen. His expression did not change. The petition is logged, he said. I am required to inform you that the Hegemony Review Board has a standard processing time of... I know, Seris said. I know the review board will dismiss it. That is not the point. Then what is the point, he said. Not unkindly, genuinely. Seris turned from the terminal and looked at Rael. The point, she said, is that for the first time in 3 years, a glass accord political asset has spoken in a public record. In her own words, by her own choice. And every Aethori in the drift who can access that record, and there are more than the hegemony believes, more than my mother believes, will read it, and they will know that the silence is not because we have agreed, it is because we have been silenced. She looked at her bare wrists. And they will know the difference, she said, because I just told them. They gave her a room at the station, small, clean, genuinely neutral, belonging to no one, the kind of room that is what it is and makes no claim about what it means. She slept for 11 hours. Rael sat in the mule's cockpit and watched the navigation readout that showed Voraxen's vessel 2 light minutes away as a single steady point of light. Not moving, waiting. He thought about the petition. He thought about 7 names in a public record. He thought about the review board that would dismiss the petition in 6 weeks or 8 weeks or 10, and about the way that dismissal would become its own kind of evidence. The record of a system refusing to hear what it had, at minimum, been forced to acknowledge existed. He thought about Mira Calloway, who had known what she was doing and had chosen to trust him to figure it out. He had some feelings about that were going to require additional processing. He put them in the folder of things he would get to eventually. He thought about the port drive coupling, which had run at 94% of rated maximum for 11 minutes and had survived, and which he was now treating with the specific gentleness one applied to anything that had done something extraordinary and then continued to exist in the aftermath. Dex, he said. Yes. Good run, a pause. Yes, Dex said. A good run. He slept in the pilot's seat. She came to the mule in the morning, which was the station's morning, its light cycle being set to something approximating standard for the benefit of the species that cared. He was awake. He had made coffee. He had 2 bulbs of it, and he gave her one, and she took it and held it with both hands without comment on the gesture. They sat in the crew compartment. The compliance manacles were still on the floor. He had not moved them. They sat there in the work-grade light, grey and seamless and empty. Voraxen is still outside neutral ground radius, she said. Yes, he will stay there. He cannot come in, and I cannot leave without encountering him. Yes, there is a TLF vessel en route. Yathoso transmitted them after we arrived. They will be here in 31 hours. She paused. The TLF has resources I don't fully know. Contacts within hegemony space. Routes through the drift that Sen doesn't know. They will be able to move me to a position where I have options. Good, Rael said. I want to go back, she said. He looked at her. Not to Seris Prime. Not to the ascendancy, to the drift, to the movement. There are 17 opposition voices still operating on Seris Prime that I listed in the petition. There are TLF cells in 6 sectors who have been working without anyone who can speak to the Thori public as an Thori public figure. She held the coffee bulb. I have a voice. I have always had a voice. I was simply in a position where it could not be heard. She looked up at him. The petition is a beginning. It is not an end. I do not want an end. I want to go back. To the work, Rael said. To the work, a pause. It is the first thing I have chosen for entirely my own reasons. I find that it clarifies everything. He thought about the lock, about the harmonic resonance, about what it had taken to generate the signal that the lock recognized as genuine autonomous will. What was it, he said? In the container, the 30 seconds. What made the difference? She was quiet for a moment. I was thinking about KL, she said, about what you told me, 26-year-old human who came to Seris Prime, because he believed that what was happening there was wrong, and that his presence mattered, who had no obligation, no political designation, no family history that required it, who came because he chose to. She looked at the manacles on the floor. I have spent my whole life in a culture that teaches obligation as the highest value, service as identity, duty as self, and I have argued against it, and protested against it, and been silenced for arguing against it, but I had never until that moment understood it in my body. Her voice was quiet and precise. Rael Voss came to Seris Prime freely. He had nothing to gain, and he came anyway, and he died for it, and it was not my duty. It was simply what he chose to do. And I thought, that is what free choice sounds like. I had never heard it before, not with my own nervous system. The crew compartment was quiet. The mule thrummed gently around them. And the lock knew, Rael said. The lock knew, she said. He didn't say anything. He finished his coffee. He looked at the compliance manacles on the floor. He thought about kicking them under the equipment locker, and then he thought about leaving them where they were, because sometimes the things that were gone needed to still be visible for a while. I'm going to go back to Port Vareth, he said eventually. Get the thermal coupling fixed. Find the next job. She nodded. After the TLF vessel arrives, he said. And you're clear. Yes, she looked at him, Rael. The petition. Your name is in the public record. Vareth Syndicate knows who you are. He already knew who I was. I'm the pilot who didn't deliver his package. It is more complex than that now. He will not be able to act against you inside hegemony space without generating a record that references the petition, which means you are technically protected by the thing we created. But it also means you are attached to it. You are a public witness in a public petition. That is not something that goes away. He turned that over. I've been nobody in particular for 3 years, he said, running cargo in the drift, not asking what it means. Rael used to say I could be doing something that matters. What do you think? She said. Now. He looked at the empty coffee bulb in his hand. He thought about the coupling that had held at 94%. He thought about 912 cred marks and the specific loneliness of being a very good pilot, going nowhere in particular. I think, he said slowly, that Rael was right and that I knew it, and that I needed 11 months' worth of someone else's situation to get there. He paused. I also think that I have a thermal coupling to fix, and that the next job is not going to pay itself. The TLF pays its couriers, Seris said. He looked at her. Yath also told me, she said. Last night, before I slept. She said that the Sareth post has been looking for a reliable drift pilot for 8 months. Someone who knows the unmonitored channels. Someone with a ship that is not on the primary registry. A pause. Someone that Mira Calloway trusts. Mira Calloway didn't tell me what I was carrying. Mira Calloway sent you a job she could not offer to anyone who would not eventually figure it out. That is a fairly specific category of trust. He sat with this. If I take that job, he said, Vareth Syndicate and the hegemony have my name attached to a public petition, and then I disappear into the drift running supplies for the TLF. Yes, that is not a situation that is easy to undo. No. It also solves the 900 credmark problem, the thermal coupling problem, and the Vethara problem. Who is Vethara? My part's creditor. Grell, very disappointed, silences. Yes, she said. It also solves those. He stood up. He picked up the compliance manacles from the floor. He turned them over in his hands, those bands of grey hegemony alloy that had been designed to manage a person's location and status and the trajectory of their life. He carried them to the mule's waste processor and fed them through. The processor accepted them. Dex said nothing, which was again the right thing. "I'll talk to Yath also," Rael said. Part 8. What remains? The TLF vessel arrived 29 hours later, which was 2 hours ahead of estimate. It was a modified hauler, not so different from the mule in age and purpose, and its crew of 4 moved with the efficiency of people who did difficult things in limited time on a regular basis. Vorak Sen's enforcement vessel remained outside the neutral ground radius throughout. He made no additional transmissions. He logged the situation with the precision of a man who understood that he had been outmaneuvered in a way that would require careful reporting to minimize damage. The petition had been accessed 312 times in the public archive by the time the TLF vessel docked. The opposition media on Tharis Prime had it within 6 hours of filing. 2 Aethery Council members had issued statements acknowledging its receipt within 18 hours. They were careful statements, neither endorsement nor condemnation, but they were states, which was itself a kind of acknowledgement that something had changed. Rael talked to Yath also. He agreed to terms. He sent Mira Calloway a message that said only, "Next time tell me." She replied in 4 minutes. He chose to interpret the speed as acknowledgement. He was in the mule's cargo hold doing the first walkthrough for what was going to be a TLF supply run, the kind of mundane logistics work that formed the circulatory system of any movement, invisible and essential, when Seris came in. She was carrying something small. A device he didn't recognize, slim, dark, the size of a closed fist, with the specific texture of Aethori manufacture, which was smoother than most hegemony-adjacent materials in a way that suggested something organic in the fabrication process. "A resonance recorder," she said. The TLF had one aboard. He looked at it. "In Aethery tradition," she said, "when 2 people part after sharing something that matters, they exchange resonance, not speech. The harmonic register. What the body carries that the voice cannot fully contain." She held it out. "I recorded mine. I want you to have it." He took it. It was lighter than he expected, warm from her hands. "What does it say?" he said. She looked at him with that flat, clear quality. The resonance in the air was steady and complex and entirely present. "It says, 'I will carry this. You are not a footnote.'" The cargo hold was very quiet. He turned the recorder over in his hands. He thought about 7 names in a public record. He thought about the coupling that had held. He thought about his brother, 26 years old, choosing freely to go somewhere because it was the right thing, leaving a footnote that was also a name in a sealed register that a princess had put there herself. "He would have liked you," Rael said. "I think," Seris said, "I would have liked him." She put her hand on his arm for a moment, a brief, deliberate contact, the kind that carries weight precisely because it is brief, and then she let go and stepped back. "The TLF vessel is ready," she said. "Yeah," he said. "Go." She went. He stood in the hold for a while, the resonance recorder in his hand, and then he put it carefully in the inner pocket of his jacket, close enough that he could feel its warmth against his ribs when he breathed. He closed up the hold. "DX," he said, "ready when you are. We have a supply run to prep. I'm going to need the port drive fully assessed before we go anywhere. Already done." The coupling held with no structural degradation. I remain professionally amazed. "It's a good ship." "It's a stubborn ship," Dex said, "which is not quite the same thing, but which serves the same purpose." Rael went up to the cockpit and sat in the pilot's seat. He ran the pre-departure sequence. He watched the navigation readout as the TLF vessel disengaged from the way station and moved out into the drift, toward the Sareth expanse, toward the unmonitored channels that ran through the space between hegemony traffic lanes. Vorak Sen's vessel tracked it for a while. And then, because he was a man who understood what had happened here and what it would cost him to make it worse, Sen turned his ship around and went the other way. Rael watched until both vessels were off his detection range. He was alone in the drift, which was not a new condition. The drift was dark and vast and old, and it did not care one way or another what happened in it. But the mule was warm, and Dex was running, and in his inner pocket there was the shape of a device carrying a sound he had not listened to yet. He waited until they were 4 hours out from Vethara, running steady on the new heading, before he took it out. He held it in his hands. He pressed the activation point that Seris had shown him. The sound that came out was not loud. It was not even by strict definition music. It was a resonance, a harmonic building through 3 layers, shifting in a way that was not quite predictable and not quite random, carrying information in the way that the aethery carried it, in frequencies that moved through the middle of the sternum and settled somewhere south of the throat. It lasted 47 seconds. He played it twice. He sat in the cockpit with the drift moving past and his hands loose on the controls and the specific quality of silence that a room has after a sound has been in it. The weight he had been carrying for 6 years, the weight of Kale, the weight of the things he hadn't done and the things he'd done instead, and the long ongoing conversation he'd been having with his brother's memory about rent and what a human being was for, did something. It did not disappear. He had been around long enough to know that grief did not disappear. It shifted from weight to something else. Not lighter exactly, differently carried. The kind of carried that has direction in it. He put the recorder back in his pocket. "Dex," he said. "Yes. Tell me about the supply route." Dex told him about the supply route. Outside, the drift was dark and enormous, and entirely indifferent to whether the small warm machine crossing it contained a person who had made a decision or a person who was still making one. The tethered mule ran steady at cruise speed, port drive at nominal thermal coupling sound, the atmospheric recycler doing its vintage best. Somewhere in the drift, a TLF vessel was running unmonitored channels. In a public archive, a petition had 312 accesses and was climbing. On Tharis Prime, an opposition voice was reading a document that contained 7 names and the first public words of a woman who had been silenced for 11 months. In the hegemony's records, a compliance director was filing a report that would need to be very carefully worded. In a register that was sealed but still existed, a name: Rael Voss. Not a footnote. A name! The mule ran on. She was never free. Not as a child promised in betrothal. Not as a princess trained to serve a function. Not as a political ward traded for resource rights. Not as a prisoner in a grey metal container marked cultural artifacts. She chose her own life for the first time in a cargo hold in the middle of the drift, at 31 years old, with hegemony manacles on her wrists and a human smuggler sitting on a cargo crate who had told her honestly that he had not decided yet. That choice, the first one that was entirely hers, resonated at a frequency the lock recognized, because the lock was looking for something very specific. The sound of a person who is free, not because someone opened a door, but because they finally understood that the door had always been theirs. This is the story of Seris Vethara, who was never free until she was, and of Rael Voss, who was never doing something that mattered until he was. This has been She Was Never Free, a Marcus's Galactic Tales original HFY story. If this story reached something in you, if it reminded you that the most dangerous thing a cynical person can do is open a door they were paid to keep shut, then it did what stories are for. Thank you for listening. Until next time.